The termination papers felt like a physical blow, each word a shard of ice piercing my skin. They stood there, smugly satisfied, as I packed my belongings into a cardboard box, a pathetic monument to years of dedication. The weight of their betrayal was a crushing force, pushing me to the edge of an abyss I never knew existed. But beneath the surface of my apparent defeat, a plan began to simmer. They wouldn't see it coming. If you cherish your sister, subscribe now. My name is Aubrey, and for 10 years, I poured my heart and soul into the Kingston Group, a real estate firm that had become my second family. I started as a wide-eyed intern, fresh out of college, and worked my way up to senior project manager. I closed deals worth millions, navigated complex negotiations, and mentored countless junior employees. I was, by all accounts, an indispensable asset to the company. Or so I thought. The Kingston Group owned several properties in the city, but their crown jewel, and the building where their corporate headquarters was located, was leased from a woman named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a pillar of the community, a kind and generous soul who had built her real estate empire from the ground up. She and my boss, Charles Kingston, had a handshake agreement spanning decades, a testament to their mutual respect and trust. I admired Eleanor immensely, not just for her business acumen but for her unwavering integrity. That's why I was floored when I overheard Charles and his viper of a VP, a woman named Victoria Sterling, discussing their plan to remove Eleanor from the equation. They wanted to acquire the building outright, but Eleanor had refused to sell, citing sentimental value and her commitment to the tenants. Their solution? To manufacture a reason to terminate her lease, forcing her into a corner where selling would be her only option. I tried to tell myself that I misheard, that there was some logical explanation. But the cold, calculating tone in their voices left no room for doubt. They were planning to destroy a good woman's livelihood for their own personal gain. The following weeks were a blur of meticulously crafted lies and fabricated evidence. Victoria, with her icy demeanor and sharp tongue, spearheaded the operation. She scrutinized every clause of Eleanor's lease, searching for loopholes and technicalities. She pressured building inspectors to find non-existent violations and harassed tenants to file frivolous complaints. Charles, meanwhile, played the role of the concerned friend, feigning sympathy while subtly undermining Eleanor's position. I watched in horror as their plan unfolded, feeling increasingly helpless and disgusted. I wanted to warn Eleanor, to expose their treachery, but I knew that doing so would put a target on my back. Charles and Victoria were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their ambitions. I was trapped in a moral dilemma, torn between my loyalty to Eleanor and my fear of retaliation. The stress was eating me alive, manifesting in sleepless nights and constant anxiety. My performance at work suffered, and I became increasingly withdrawn from my colleagues. I knew that I was walking on thin ice, that my days at the Kingston Group were numbered. The inevitable finally happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was summoned to Charles's office, where Victoria stood beside him, a smug grin plastered on her face. They accused me of insubordination, citing my declining performance and negative attitude. They presented me with a stack of trumped-up charges, each one more ridiculous than the last. I knew it was a sham, a pretense to get rid of me before I could expose their scheme. I tried to defend myself, but my words fell on deaf ears. They had already made up their minds. As I gathered my belongings, Victoria couldn't resist a parting shot. "Consider this a lesson, Aubrey," she sneered. "Loyalty to the company always comes first. You should have learned that a long time ago." I bit back a retort, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I walked out of that office with my head held high, but inside, I was crumbling. They had taken my job, my reputation, and my sense of security. But they had also awakened something within me, a burning desire for justice, a thirst for revenge that would consume me until they paid for what they had done. The person I trusted most was one of them. My own boyfriend, Mark, a rising star in the finance department at Kingston. He knew about my concerns, my anxieties, everything. He feigned sympathy, offering a shoulder to cry on, all the while reporting back to Charles and Victoria, solidifying their narrative that I was a disgruntled employee. The depth of their deception was staggering. I replayed our conversations in my head, realizing how carefully he had manipulated me, extracting information and using it against me. The pain was unbearable, a cocktail of betrayal, anger, and humiliation. I felt like a fool, a pawn in their twisted game. But amidst the wreckage of my shattered trust, a new resolve began to form. I would not let them win. I would not let them destroy Eleanor's life and career. I would expose their lies and bring them to justice, even if it was the last thing I did. The world felt muted, colors faded, as I navigated the immediate aftermath of my termination. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford, my nights filled with replays of Charles's smug face and Victoria's venomous words. Each morning, the weight of injustice pressed down on me, a suffocating blanket of anxiety and despair. I started sending out resumes, hoping to land another job quickly, but the Kingston Group's shadow loomed large. Their reputation preceded me, and whispers of my insubordination seemed to have poisoned the well. Rejection emails piled up in my inbox, each one a fresh stab wound to my already fragile ego. I tried to reach out to former colleagues, people I considered friends, but most of them avoided my calls or offered vague, non-committal responses. The fear of retribution from Charles and Victoria had effectively silenced them. I felt isolated, abandoned, as if I had been cast out into the wilderness. Even Mark, my supposed ally, had vanished, his phone number disconnected, his social media account scrubbed clean. It was as if he had never existed, a phantom limb reminding me of my own gullibility. Desperate, I decided to approach Eleanor Vance directly. I knew it was a risk, that Charles and Victoria might be monitoring her communications, but I couldn't stand by and watch them destroy her. I drafted a carefully worded email, hinting at the scheme without revealing too much, and requested a meeting. To my relief, she responded within hours, agreeing to meet me at a small cafe near her office. When I arrived, Eleanor greeted me with a warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She was even more radiant in person than I remembered, her presence exuding strength and grace. I hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject, but Eleanor sensed my unease and gently prodded me to speak my mind. I took a deep breath and laid out the situation as delicately as I could, explaining Charles and Victoria's plan to undermine her lease and force her to sell the building. As I spoke, Eleanor's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with anger. But beneath the anger, I also saw a flicker of sadness, a hint of betrayal. She had trusted Charles for years, considered him a friend. The realization that he would stoop to such depths clearly wounded her deeply. After I finished, Eleanor remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the cafe window. Finally, she turned back to me, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Aubrey," she said. "I appreciate you coming to me with this. I had my suspicions, but I needed proof." She explained that she had noticed subtle changes in Charles's behavior in recent months, a coolness in his tone, a reluctance to meet her eye. She had dismissed it as stress or preoccupation, but now, in light of my revelations, everything clicked into place. Eleanor was determined to fight back, but she knew that she was facing formidable opponents. Charles and Victoria had deep pockets and powerful connections. They wouldn't hesitate to use every weapon at their disposal to crush her. She asked if I had any concrete evidence of their scheme, anything that could be used to expose them. I confessed that I didn't, that I had been too afraid to document their conversations or gather incriminating documents. I had been so focused on protecting myself that I had failed to protect her. Eleanor, however, seemed unfazed by my lack of evidence. She had a plan, a long shot, but it was worth trying. She explained that Charles's Achilles' heel was his vanity, his insatiable need for recognition and praise. He craved the approval of the city's elite, the wealthy investors and influential politicians who held the keys to his success. Eleanor believed that if she could publicly humiliate Charles, expose his treachery to his peers, she could cripple his reputation and undermine his ambitions. But to do that, she needed information, dirt, anything that could be used to paint him in a negative light. She asked if I knew of any skeletons in his closet, any past indiscretions or shady deals that could be brought to light. I racked my brain, trying to recall any whispers or rumors I had heard during my time at the Kingston Group. But Charles was a master of self-preservation, careful to keep his private life separate from his professional dealings. I came up empty-handed, feeling like a failure all over again. As I was about to apologize, something clicked in my memory. A fleeting conversation I had overheard between Charles and Victoria, a mention of a problem with a development project in the West End. They had quickly changed the subject, but the unease in their voices had lingered with me. I told Eleanor about the conversation, explaining that I didn't know the details, but that it seemed like something was amiss with the West End project. Eleanor's eyes lit up. "That's it," she said. "That's our leverage." She explained that the West End project was a pet project of Charles's, a high-profile development that he had been touting as a symbol of his vision and success. If there was trouble with the project, it could be a major blow to his reputation. Eleanor asked me to investigate, to dig up any information I could find about the West End project. It was a daunting task, but I was determined to do whatever I could to help her. My own revenge could wait. Eleanor's reputation, her life's work, was on the line. I was no longer just fighting for myself, I was fighting for her, for justice, for the principle that good people shouldn't be allowed to be trampled by greed and ambition. The days that followed were a descent into darkness. I threw myself into researching the West End project, spending hours poring over public records, planning documents, and news articles. The more I dug, the more I realized the extent of Charles's corruption. The project, a mixed-use development of luxury condos and retail space, was riddled with code violations, environmental hazards, and financial irregularities. Charles had cut corners at every turn, prioritizing profit over safety and sustainability. He had bribed city officials to overlook the violations, and he had used shell companies to funnel money into his own offshore accounts. The West End project was not a symbol of his success, it was a monument to his greed and deceit. But uncovering the truth was only half the battle. I needed to find a way to expose it, to present the evidence in a way that would be undeniable and irrefutable. I considered going to the media, but I worried that Charles would use his influence to bury the story or discredit me. I thought about contacting the authorities, but I feared that they were already in Charles's pocket. I was running out of options, and my desperation was growing. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day of research, I found myself standing on the edge of the city's highest bridge, staring down at the churning water below. The wind whipped around me, carrying the sounds of the city, sirens, car horns, distant shouts, all blending into a cacophony of despair. The temptation to just let go, to surrender to the darkness, was almost overwhelming. It would be so easy, so simple, to end the pain, to silence the voices in my head. The Kingston Group had taken everything from me. Was there any point in fighting back? Then, I thought of Eleanor. I pictured her kind face, her unwavering spirit, her determination to fight for what was right. I remembered her words of encouragement, her belief in me. I knew that if I gave up, I would be letting her down. I would be allowing Charles and Victoria to win. And I couldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. A spark of defiance ignited within me, a refusal to be defeated. I stepped back from the edge, my body trembling, my heart pounding. The darkness hadn't won. Not yet. I still had a fight left in me. I returned to my apartment, my mind racing. I knew that I couldn't take on Charles and Victoria alone. I needed help, allies, people who believed in justice and were willing to risk everything to expose the truth. But who could I trust? Everyone I knew seemed to be afraid of Charles or complicit in his schemes. Then, I remembered David, a former colleague who had left the Kingston Group a few years earlier, citing ethical concerns. David was a brilliant architect, a man of principle, and he had always been skeptical of Charles's business practices. I had lost touch with him after he left the company, but I knew that he was still working in the city. I found his contact information online and sent him a message, explaining my situation and asking for his help. To my surprise, he responded almost immediately, expressing his outrage at Charles's behavior and offering his full support. David had been quietly gathering evidence of Charles's corruption for years, hoping to one day expose him. He had copies of internal memos, emails, and financial documents that implicated Charles in a wide range of illegal activities. Together, we had enough evidence to bring Charles down, to destroy his reputation and send him to prison. The plan began to take shape. I would act as the inside person, gathering information and feeding it to David. He would then analyze the data, verify its authenticity, and prepare it for public consumption. We would work in secret, communicating through encrypted channels, careful to avoid detection. It was a risky endeavor, but we were both determined to see it through. The first step was to regain Charles's trust, to convince him that I was no longer a threat. I started by sending him a carefully crafted email, apologizing for my negative attitude and expressing my regret for the way things had ended. I hinted that I was struggling to find a new job and that I was starting to see things from his perspective. To my surprise, Charles responded within days, inviting me to meet him for coffee. I knew that this was a test, that he was trying to gauge my sincerity. I prepared myself mentally, rehearsing my lines, determined to play the part of the repentant employee. When I met Charles at the coffee shop, he greeted me with a forced smile, his eyes cold and calculating. He listened patiently as I groveled and apologized, occasionally interjecting with a condescending remark or a veiled threat. But I didn't flinch. I maintained my composure, playing the role to perfection. By the end of the meeting, Charles seemed convinced. He offered me a consulting position at the Kingston Group, a low-level job with limited responsibilities, but with access to valuable information. I accepted the offer, knowing that it was my chance to infiltrate the company and gather the evidence I needed to bring him down. The game had changed. I was no longer the victim. I was the planner. And my revenge was just beginning. I walked back into the Kingston Group a ghost of my former self, but armed with a burning purpose. Charles, ever the showman, made a grand display of welcoming me back, likely for the benefit of Victoria and any other prying eyes. He ushered me into a small, windowless office, a far cry from the spacious corner suite I once occupied. It was a clear message: I was back, but I was no longer a threat. He was wrong. This was my war room. I smiled, played the part of the humbled employee, and began to subtly map the digital terrain of the office. My goal was to locate the servers where Charles and Victoria stored their most sensitive communications and financial records related to the West End project. I needed access, and I needed it without raising suspicion. I spent my days performing menial tasks, answering phones, and filing documents, all the while observing the office's security protocols and the habits of my colleagues. I paid close attention to the IT department, noting their routines and identifying any potential weaknesses in their system. I knew that breaching the network would be risky, but it was the only way to get the concrete evidence we needed. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, during a fire drill, I noticed that one of the IT technicians had left his workstation unlocked. It was a momentary lapse, but it was all I needed. While everyone else was evacuating the building, I slipped back inside and made my way to the technician's desk. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat down and began to navigate his computer. I quickly located the server access credentials and copied them onto a thumb drive. I knew that I only had a few minutes before someone noticed my absence, so I worked quickly and efficiently. As I was about to leave, I noticed a folder on the desktop labeled West End Project Backup. It was like a gift from the heavens. I copied the entire folder onto my thumb drive and slipped out of the office, just as the all-clear signal sounded. Back in my apartment, David and I pored over the contents of the backup folder. It was a treasure trove of incriminating information, emails, financial statements, construction reports, and even surveillance footage. We found evidence of bribery, fraud, and gross negligence. We discovered that Charles and Victoria had knowingly used substandard materials in the construction of the West End project, putting the lives of future residents at risk. They had also falsified environmental impact reports, concealing the presence of toxic waste on the property. The depth of their depravity was staggering. But the most damning piece of evidence was a series of emails between Charles and a corrupt city councilman, detailing a quid pro quo arrangement. Charles had promised to donate generously to the councilman's re-election campaign in exchange for his approval of the West End project, despite its numerous violations. This was the smoking gun we needed to bring Charles down. Now came the challenge of presenting the evidence in a way that would be both impactful and irrefutable. We knew that simply handing the information over to the authorities wouldn't be enough. Charles had powerful friends in high places, and he would likely be able to manipulate the investigation or bury the evidence altogether. We needed to expose him publicly, to create a media firestorm that he couldn't control. David suggested creating a website, a digital repository of all the evidence we had gathered. We would present the information in a clear and concise manner, with links to the original documents and sources. We would also include a timeline of events, highlighting Charles's involvement in the West End project and his attempts to cover up his crimes. The website would be anonymous, hosted on a secure server in a foreign country, making it difficult for Charles to trace it back to us. We would then send the link to the website to every major news outlet in the city, as well as to key government officials and community leaders. The goal was to create a groundswell of public outrage that would force the authorities to take action. As David worked on the website, I focused on gathering additional evidence and preparing for the inevitable backlash. I knew that Charles would stop at nothing to protect himself, and that he would likely try to discredit me or even harm me. I installed security cameras in my apartment and took steps to protect my online identity. I also consulted with a lawyer, who advised me on my legal rights and prepared a statement to be released in the event of my disappearance or incapacitation. I was determined to be prepared for anything. One evening, while I was working late at the Kingston Group, I overheard Charles and Victoria arguing in Charles's office. I pressed my ear against the door and listened intently. They were discussing the West End project, and it was clear that they were starting to panic. The city councilman had been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury, and he was threatening to expose Charles's involvement in the scheme. Charles was furious, pacing back and forth and shouting at Victoria. He accused her of being careless and of leaving a paper trail that could implicate them both. Victoria, in turn, blamed Charles for his recklessness and his insatiable greed. The argument escalated, and I could hear the sound of objects being thrown and glass shattering. I realized that their carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and that their desperation was growing. This was our chance to strike. I met with David that night and shared what I had overheard. We agreed that it was time to launch the website. We finalized the content, double-checked our sources, and prepared to hit send. As I sat in front of my computer, my finger hovering over the enter key, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment of truth. The culmination of months of planning and sacrifice. I took a deep breath and clicked the button. The email was sent. The website was live. The truth was out there. I shut down my computer and sat back in my chair, waiting for the storm to break. I knew that my life would never be the same. But I also knew that I had done the right thing. I had exposed the truth, and I had given Eleanor Vance a fighting chance. Whatever happened next, I was ready. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, the website went viral. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the details of Charles's corruption to a city gripped with outrage. The evidence was irrefutable, the accusations damning. Charles and Victoria were caught in a firestorm of their own making. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, a sense of grim satisfaction washing over me. They had thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. But I knew this was just the beginning. Charles wouldn't go down without a fight. I steeled myself for the inevitable counterattack. It came sooner than I expected. The next morning, I woke up to find my apartment ransacked. The door had been forced open, and my belongings were scattered across the floor. My computer was gone, along with any copies of the evidence I had kept at home. It was a clear message. Charles was sending a message. He knew I was involved, and he was trying to silence me. I immediately contacted David and warned him about what had happened. We agreed to go into hiding, to disappear from the city until the storm had passed. But before we could leave, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, then answered it. "We know where you are," a voice said on the other end. "If you value your life, you'll stop what you're doing." The line went dead. My blood ran cold. They were watching me. They knew my every move. I was no longer safe. I had to act fast. I grabbed my go bag, which I had packed with essentials in case of an emergency, and raced out of my apartment. I didn't know where to go or who to trust. I was alone, hunted, and running for my life. I managed to evade Charles's people for several days, moving from motel to motel, staying one step ahead of them. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up with me. I needed to turn the tables, to go on the offensive. I decided to use Charles's arrogance against him. I knew that he would be desperate to contain the damage, to silence anyone who could implicate him in the West End scandal. He would be looking for me, but he would also be looking for anyone else who could expose his crimes. That gave me an idea. I reached out to Eleanor Vance. It was a risky move, but I knew that she was the key to bringing Charles down for good. I used an anonymous email account to send her a message, informing her that I had evidence of Charles's corruption and that I was willing to share it with her. I told her to meet me at a secluded location outside the city, and I warned her not to tell anyone about the meeting. I knew that Charles would be monitoring her communications, so I had to be careful. To my relief, Eleanor agreed to meet me. I arrived at the designated location, a deserted farmhouse on the outskirts of town, and waited anxiously for her to arrive. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. The air was thick with tension. I didn't know if I could trust her, but I had no other choice. A car pulled up to the farmhouse, and Eleanor stepped out. She looked tired and worn, but her eyes were still filled with determination. I approached her cautiously, my hand on my weapon. "Eleanor," I said, "thank you for coming." "I want to know the truth," she replied. "Tell me everything." I spent the next few hours recounting my story, detailing Charles's corruption and my plan to expose him. I showed her the evidence I had gathered, the emails, the financial statements, the construction reports. She listened intently, her expression growing darker with each revelation. By the end of the meeting, she was visibly shaken. "I can't believe he would do this," she said. "He's destroyed everything I've worked for." "I know," I replied. "But we can't let him get away with it. We have to fight back." That's when I laid out the final trap. I told Eleanor that I had a plan to lure Charles out into the open, to expose him in front of the entire city. I explained that I had leaked information to the media that suggested I was about to reveal even more damaging evidence about the West End project. I told her that I had arranged a press conference at a downtown hotel, where I would present my findings to the public. I knew that Charles would be desperate to stop me, that he would do anything to prevent me from speaking. I anticipated that he would try to intimidate me, to threaten me, or even to unalive me. But I was ready for him. I had set a trap, a carefully orchestrated plan to expose his crimes and bring him to justice. What I didn't tell Eleanor was that the press conference was a setup. There was no new evidence. There was no intention of speaking to the media. The entire event was a ruse, designed to lure Charles into a trap. I had arranged for the police to be waiting at the hotel, ready to arrest him and his associates. I had also planted hidden cameras throughout the building, to capture his every move. I wanted to make sure that he couldn't deny his involvement in the West End scandal. I wanted to make sure that he paid for his crimes. I looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "It's going to be dangerous." "I know," I replied. "But it's the only way to stop him. We have to be brave. We have to be willing to risk everything." The day of the press conference arrived, and I felt a knot of tension in my stomach. I arrived at the hotel early, checking in with the police and making sure that everything was in place. The media was already gathering outside, eager to hear what I had to say. I could feel Charles's presence, his unseen eyes watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I walked into the ballroom, the site of the press conference, and surveyed the scene. The room was packed with reporters, photographers, and television cameras. The air was thick with anticipation. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage, ready to face my enemy. As I approached the podium, I saw him. Charles Kingston, standing at the back of the room, his face a mask of rage. He was surrounded by his bodyguards, their eyes scanning the crowd, searching for any sign of trouble. Our eyes met, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. He knew. He knew that he was walking into a trap. But it was too late. The game was over. I smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice ringing out through the ballroom. "I have gathered you here today to expose the truth about Charles Kingston and the West End project." Before I could finish my sentence, the doors of the ballroom burst open, and a team of police officers stormed into the room. "Charles Kingston," the officer shouted, "you are under arrest." The room erupted in chaos. The reporters screamed, the photographers flashed their cameras, and Charles's bodyguards lunged forward, trying to protect him. But it was no use. The police officers quickly overpowered them and placed Charles in handcuffs. As they led him out of the ballroom, he turned to me, his eyes filled with hatred. "You haven't won," he snarled. This isn't over. I just smiled and watched as they dragged him away. It was over. He had lost. And I had finally gotten my revenge. But the real shock was yet to come. As Charles was being escorted out, Victoria stepped forward, a sinister smile on her face. "Checkmate," she whispered. And then the lights went out. The ballroom plunged into darkness, an immediate, suffocating black. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by panicked shouts. Then, the emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie green glow on the scene. The police were struggling to maintain order, reporters were scrambling for their equipment, and Charles was being hustled out of the building, his face a mask of confusion and rage. But it was Victoria who held my attention. She stood there, bathed in the sickly green light, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. And then I understood. The lights going out, it was all part of her plan. It was a distraction, a way to cover her tracks. As the police led Charles away, Victoria slipped through the crowd, disappearing into the night. I tried to follow her, but the chaos in the ballroom made it impossible. She was gone. I felt a surge of anger, a burning desire for revenge. She wasn't going to get away with this. Not again. I pushed through the throng of people, ignoring the shouts and the flashing cameras. I had to find Victoria, to make her pay for what she had done. I raced out of the hotel, scanning the streets for any sign of her. The city was alive with activity, cars honking, people rushing to and fro. It was like searching for a ghost in a graveyard. But I refused to give up. I knew that Victoria was still out there, plotting, scheming, trying to stay one step ahead of the law. I had to find her before she disappeared completely. I remembered something Victoria had said to me once, a casual remark about her family's summer house on the coast. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address, my heart pounding with anticipation. As the cab sped through the city streets, I imagined Victoria hiding out in her summer house, sipping champagne and laughing at my misfortune. I vowed that she wouldn't get away with it. I would hunt her down, expose her crimes, and bring her to justice. The cab pulled up to the summer house, a sprawling mansion overlooking the ocean. The house was dark and silent, but I could sense Victoria's presence. I paid the driver and approached the house cautiously, my hand on my weapon. I slipped through the front gate and crept up to the front door, peering through the windows. I could see Victoria inside, pacing back and forth, talking on the phone. She looked agitated, her face contorted with anger. I pressed my ear against the door and listened intently. "I told you to take care of him," she was saying. "He was supposed to disappear. No loose ends." I realized that she was talking about me. She had ordered someone to silence me, to make me disappear. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe the depth of her depravity. She was willing to go to any lengths to protect herself, even if it meant unaliving innocent people. I kicked down the door and burst into the house, my weapon raised. Victoria screamed and dropped the phone, her eyes wide with terror. "You," she gasped. "How did you find me?" "It doesn't matter," I said, my voice cold and hard. "It's over, Victoria. Your crimes are exposed. Your empire is crumbling. There's nowhere left to run." Victoria lunged at me, her nails scratching at my face. I dodged her attack and grabbed her by the arm, twisting it behind her back. She cried out in pain, struggling to break free. "You can't do this," she sobbed. "I'm too powerful. I have too much money. You'll never get away with it." "I already have," I replied. "It's over, Victoria. You've lost." I dragged her outside, to the edge of the cliff overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below, a symphony of destruction. I pointed to the city lights in the distance, a reminder of the world she had tried to control. "Look at it, Victoria," I said. "It's all slipping away. Your power, your wealth, your reputation. It's all gone." Victoria stared at the city lights, her eyes filled with despair. She knew that I was right. Her life was over. The game was done. The police arrived moments later, sirens blaring, lights flashing. They took Victoria into custody, her face buried in her hands. As they led her away, she looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with hatred. But I didn't care. I had won. I had exposed her crimes, brought her to justice, and avenged Eleanor Vance. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Charles and Victoria's corruption was revealed. The West End project was shut down, the substandard materials were replaced, and the residents were given a safe and habitable place to live. Charles and Victoria were charged with multiple counts of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy. They were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to decades in prison. Their empire crumbled, their wealth was seized, and their reputation was ruined. They lost everything. As for me, I disappeared from the public eye, retreating to a quiet life, away from the spotlight. I had done what I had to do, and I had no regrets. The memories of the betrayal, the pain, and the struggle would always stay with me. But I had emerged from the darkness, stronger and more determined than ever. I had learned that revenge isn't sweet. It's necessary. Sometimes, it's the only way to achieve justice, to protect the innocent, and to right the wrongs of the world. I just smiled. Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more justice.